The Brazos River lay across the Texas plains like a wound that never healed, its waters shifting in color with each season but never losing their air of menace. In the summer of 1882, it shrank back from its banks, cracked earth swallowing its edges as if the land itself wanted to be rid of it. Yet when the rains came, it swelled without mercy, rising past fences and barns, sweeping away cattle and wagons as though mocking human efforts at permanence. To the locals who lived along its bends, the river was more than water. It was an observer. It was patient. It remembered. And in whispers passed from mouth to ear, it was said to claim what it believed belonged to it. Families who had lost kin in its floods spoke of it not as accident, but as appetite, a thing that chose its victims and never relinquished them whole. The Dillon family knew this more than anyone. Their sons, one by one, had met the river. Men in town shook their heads at the curse spoken over that household, yet no one spoke too loudly of it. Droughts could ruin fortunes, cattle fever could strike overnight, but a family's boys, every heir to a name and property, vanishing into the same water year after year was not simple bad luck. It was a pattern, and patterns carry intent. Still, in an era where misfortune was expected, the Dillons were pitied rather than questioned. No law asked why. No preacher looked too long into Isaac Dillon's eyes when he took his pew each Sunday. The silence of neighbors protected him, though some could not sleep when they recalled the way his lips tightened whenever the river's name was spoken. The land around the Brazos was booming. Trails carved deep grooves into the plains as cattle were driven north, and men grew rich on herds and land speculation. Rail lines pushed further, bringing strangers and money, but also bringing a fevered pace to life. Droughts blistered the soil, forcing desperate ranchers to rely more heavily on the river crossings. Every family knew the risks of swollen waters or collapsing banks. When drownings came, they were often explained away as part of life's brutal bargain. That is what allowed the story of the Dillon sons to take root without ever being challenged. What should have raised suspicion instead folded neatly into the logic of survival in a hard country. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion festered. Some remembered seeing Isaac lead his boys down to the banks on evenings when others were home mending tools or sharing supper. He would not look at neighbors who passed, his hand gripping the shoulders of whichever son trailed him that night. The boys carried stones in their hands, round ones pulled from the riverbed itself. Isaac spoke of discipline, of building strength by carrying burdens. The neighbors told themselves it was only the training of sons for ranch labor. But when each boy vanished, the memory of those stone-bearing walks returned with a darker tint. The boys had carried offerings and the river had accepted. The whispers began small, murmured between mothers at the well or old men at the saloon. First William, strong and sure-footed, swept away while fording. Then Thomas, swallowed during a sudden storm. Then Henry, gone during what should have been a calm crossing. None of the bodies were ever pulled out intact, though some were found days later downriver, bloated and marked, unrecognizable but for clothes and boots. Isaac buried them with closed coffins and spoke words that chilled those who attended. He said the river takes what belongs to it and no man should fight it. The Brazos became more than geography in the Dillon story. It became the executioner and Isaac its priest. Whether he believed the river demanded payment or whether he used it to cover something only he knew, no one could say. But the facts were steady like ticks in a ledger. Each boy gone, each funeral quiet, each season marked by grief repeating itself as if rehearsed. The townsfolk grew careful not to let their own children wander near the Dillons. At night they locked their doors more tightly, as if that could keep away a hunger not of man but of something older. The river waited still. Every bend and ripple seemed to hold its breath for the next offering. The cattle trails might shift, the rains might come or fail, but the Brazos endured, collecting its toll with a patience that outlasted families and towns. And those who watched the Dillon family's decline knew in their bones this was no random tragedy. It was a rhythm, deliberate and cruel, as if the river itself had been chosen by someone or something to cleanse, to take, to erase. And deep within the silence that followed each death, there lingered a sense that Isaac Dillon was not grieving but obeying, carrying out a design that he alone understood. The story of the Dillon sons did not begin with death but with the river that had always been waiting, a witness hidden in plain sight, its currents carrying secrets too heavy for most to name. And as the last son still lived under Isaac's roof, the town knew in their hearts what the water already knew. The river was not yet done. Isaac Dillon stood as the kind of man people pointed to as an example of steadiness in uncertain times. In the small Texas town that leaned on cattle drives and weather forecasts, his name was spoken with a mix of respect and unease. He was admired for his endurance, for how his ranch prospered even in drought years, for how he never bent his back to liquor or gambling when others did. To the public eye, he was a man of discipline, a figure who carried himself with the gravity of a man who believed his life was guided by higher order. Yet behind his reputation was something the town could not see. Isaac was not simply a rancher with pride. He was a man who believed his family was an extension of his will, his lineage a vessel of something that needed guarding, shaping, and sacrificing. His ranch house bore little warmth. Its walls were lined not with decorations or sentimental heirlooms, but with shelves of ledgers. In those pages, written in careful hand, were records that stretched back years. Birth weights of cattle, the rainfall measured each season, the age of every horse, the yield of each acre of land. But woven among the numbers were records of his children, as though they too were stock to be evaluated. Each boy had his height marked at intervals, his weight, his hours of labor completed. Isaac drew hard lines through pages where one boy failed at a task, as if erasing weakness from the record itself. He did not look upon his sons as children to be loved, but as assets, figures in an equation that would either prove his blood strong or expose it as flawed. Neighbors who praised him in town never saw the way he treated his boys at home. Around others he was strict but polite, measured in his speech, never raising his voice, never cursing. But in the isolation of his house, his silence was sharper than cruelty. If one of his sons spoke out of turn, Isaac would press a hand down on the boy's shoulder and guide him outside. Hours later they would return, the boy pale, lips sealed, carrying in his eyes the quiet knowledge of punishment. There were no bruises seen, no whips hung on walls. Isaac's methods were not those of outburst or common rage. They were calculated, controlled, meant to leave no mark that a neighbor could call violence. He believed in shaping obedience with methods that cut deeper than skin. His obsession with purity extended to how he spoke of his bloodline. In the quiet of his ledgers, he wrote notes not only about his children but about their mother, Mary, whom he measured in terms of her usefulness. He marked the number of pregnancies, the strength of each child, the illnesses she endured. In church, when Scripture spoke of sons as arrows in the quiver of a man, Isaac nodded not with devotion but with satisfaction. To him his children were instruments, proof that his name would endure past him. Yet endurance meant control. It meant eliminating weakness before it spread. The townsfolk called him fair because he never cheated in a trade, never shorted a hand his wages, but fairness was not kindness. Isaac's fairness was rooted in cold arithmetic, the belief that every man must receive what was owed to maintain balance. To him, mercy upset balance. Mercy allowed weakness to multiply, and so his fairness was feared more than it was trusted. What the town never knew was that Isaac's order extended beyond cattle and ledgers. He believed the river that ran near his land was tied to the very blood in his veins. He saw its strength, its floods, its droughts as mirrors of his household. In his notes he wrote of the water-cleansing soil, of water revealing truth, of water carrying away what did not belong. His boys were often walked down to the river not only for chores but for ritual. He told them they must carry stones, they must wade out until their knees trembled, they must learn to withstand the pull of the current without fear. He convinced himself this was discipline, that he was forging them into stronger men. But in his private words, written in the margins of his ledgers, there was another meaning. He spoke of offerings, of purification, of water testing flesh the way fire tested metal. Isaac Dillon's pride was not the pride of a father admiring his sons. It was the pride of a man who believed he owned them, body and soul, that their existence proved his own righteousness. He smiled in town when men spoke of his hard work, but his thoughts were always on whether his children were fulfilling the role he had carved for them. He did not ask if they were happy, if they felt love. He asked only if they were fit, if they were strong, if they could survive the trials he demanded. And if they could not, he did not weep. He recorded, he erased, he accepted. Behind the facade of respectability, Isaac was not a man consumed by temper or madness in the way townsfolk imagined evil. His darkness was colder, quieter. It was the evil of belief, the kind that convinced him his sons were not individuals but instruments, vessels to be measured, judged, and, if necessary, given back to the river that had always waited. The town saw only a patriarch. His family knew they lived under something else entirely, a man who smiled at neighbors while recording his sons like entries in a ledger of sacrifice. William Dillon was the firstborn, the boy on whose shoulders the weight of Isaac's vision fell the heaviest. He was tall for his age, broad in the chest, his hands already thickened with rope calluses before most boys in town had even finished their schooling. Neighbors would remark that William was the perfect heir, the kind of son who could keep the ranch alive long after his father was gone. Yet behind his strong build was a quietness that was not natural to youth but imposed by fear. William did not laugh openly, did not speak without waiting for the smallest nod from his father. He carried himself with the bearing of a man already judged and found wanting, as though every movement of his body was being weighed on a scale. Isaac demanded from William not only labor but proof that his lineage was unbroken, that strength was bred true. The boy bore it in silence, shoulders squared, but his eyes betrayed the truth. William was less a son than the first entry in a ledger, a model against which the others would be measured. Thomas came next, smaller in frame but sharper in mind. He noticed the details his father kept in the ledgers, the way numbers became sentences of judgment. He too was taken down to the river and told to carry stones against his chest, each stone larger than the last. Unlike William, Thomas sometimes hesitated. He asked why. He looked for meaning beyond the ritual. But in Isaac's house, questions were punished. Isaac did not strike him, but punished with silence, a silence that lasted hours, sometimes days, a silence so thick it pressed against Thomas's chest until he felt he was suffocating inside his own home. That silence was Isaac's favored weapon, more cutting than blows, more lasting than bruises. When Thomas faltered, the punishment was to be ignored, as though his existence itself was erased until he earned his way back by obedience. Henry, the third son, was different still. He had a gentleness that no amount of ritual could strip away. He lingered with animals, whispering comfort to calves that had lost their mothers, smoothing the fur of frightened colts. Isaac saw this softness not as kindness, but as weakness. He forced Henry to bear heavier stones, to stand longer in the river's current, to recite prayers of endurance until his lips bled from the cold water. Isaac told himself that he was forging the boy's spirit into iron, but in truth he was grinding away the fragile light of a child who wanted only to give comfort. At the supper table, Henry sometimes smiled faintly at his brothers, but if Isaac caught it, the smile vanished under the heavy weight of the father's gaze. Isaac forbade laughter in his home, claiming it led to disorder. Meals were eaten in silence, each bite measured, each sip of water taken as though under watch. For a boy like Henry, the silence became not only a rule but a prison. The youngest, Samuel, carried both the burden of being last and the dangerous position of being watched too closely. By the time he was old enough to join in his father's rituals, the patterns were already deeply carved. He had seen William carry stones until his chest was bruised. He had seen Thomas locked in the suffocating punishment of silence. He had seen Henry's soft nature crushed under repeated trials. Samuel learned quickly what his father wanted: obedience without question, silence without hesitation, labor without complaint. Yet deep in his young eyes there lingered something like terror. The knowledge that his fate would not differ from his brother's, that his father's rituals were not tasks but stages leading to something darker. The barn was the place of Isaac's most private punishments. It looked ordinary from the outside, the place where tools were stored, where hay was stacked. But within its walls, Isaac demanded silence. If a boy had failed, if laughter had slipped at the supper table, if hesitation had been shown at the river, he was taken to the barn. No one outside the family knew what occurred there. The sons emerged pale and trembling, lips sealed, carrying secrets they could not put into words. Some said Isaac locked them inside with nothing but the dark, forcing them to confront the silence itself until hours blurred into terror. Others whispered he bound them not with ropes but with the weight of ritual, making them stand motionless for impossible lengths of time, teaching them their bodies were not theirs but his to command. Whatever the truth, each boy carried the barn's silence back into the house, and none dared break it. Isaac measured their growth not by birthdays but against stones pulled from the riverbed. Each year he marked their heights on the barn wall, beside the deep grooves carved where wood had been cut and worn smooth by the passage of time. Next to each marking he placed a river stone, one that matched their size. These stones were kept in a separate chest, locked away as though they were holy relics. He told the boys that a man's worth was not in his words or his dreams, but in his ability to stand unbroken against the current, to hold his burden without faltering. And if one son failed, Isaac recorded it as though the failure belonged not to the boy, but to the blood itself. The Dillon sons lived in a world where laughter was a crime, where silence was law, where ritual replaced affection. They moved through their days as shadows of children, their lives reduced to obedience, their futures already claimed by the river that their father worshipped in secret. To the town, they appeared well-mannered and hard-working, boys raised right under a stern but fair hand. But behind closed doors they were being stripped of childhood, remade into vessels of their father's belief, prepared in silence for an ending only he could see. William Dillon's drowning was spoken of as tragedy, but beneath the grief was a chill no one wanted to name. He was the strongest of Isaac's sons, broad in the chest, shoulders squared by years of hard work on the ranch. Townsfolk believed if any boy could master the brazos, it would be William, and yet it was William who was found dead, pulled from the water with lungs heavy and skin marked by strange wounds. The story told in public was that he had been swept away during a river crossing, one of the countless accidents that came with driving cattle through unpredictable waters. Men shook their heads, women wept, and the preacher prayed for mercy, but in the stillness that followed, no one asked why Isaac stood so calm by the grave. His face carried no collapse of sorrow, no tremor in the voice. He said the boy had been claimed by the water as was proper, as if the river had exercised a right over his blood that no father should resist. The truth of William's death was written on his body. Those who helped drag him out swore later in whispers too low for the sheriff to hear that the wounds on his chest and arms were not the random strikes of driftwood. They were too deliberate, too clean, too much like marks carved by a steady hand. Along his ribs, shallow incisions ran in parallel, like tally marks etched into flesh. His back carried bruises in patterns of stone, round impressions that matched the river rocks his father had forced him to carry. When these details were brought before others, they were dismissed as panic, the misremembering of men who had seen too much in the water. The sheriff closed his ledger with the word accident. The town accepted it, not because they believed it, but because to believe otherwise would mean turning against a man they feared and respected. Isaac's behavior after the burial deepened the unease. He locked away William's boots in a chest, polished clean as if they had never touched mud. He recorded the boy's death in his ledgers with the same hand he used to record rainfall and cattle births, noting the date and the river's depth, writing in the margin the words, "proper offering." To the neighbors, he said the boy had served his purpose and that the river had taken what was due. It was not grief that shaped his words, but a calm acceptance, as though he had been expecting this loss and was satisfied it had come in order. In private, he returned to the river at night, alone, standing on the bank with his hat in his hands, staring at the black water as if waiting for it to answer. Mary Dillon's silence in those days was its own confession. She did not wail or rage as a mother might. Instead, she moved like a shadow through the house, her hands shaking when she passed bread at the table, her eyes never settling on Isaac's face. Neighbors who visited to offer comfort found her pale and withdrawn, lips pressed thin as if holding back words that could never be spoken. Some believed she feared for her remaining sons, that she understood what others refused to admit, that William's death was not an accident, not a random cruelty of the river, but part of a design Isaac had long been shaping. The river itself became a character in the town's memory, not a body of water, but a presence that hovered over every conversation. Children were warned not to play too near it, though no one could explain why in terms that made sense. Men muttered that the river had grown hungry, that once it had tasted Dillon blood it would not stop. But those closest to the truth knew hunger was not the river's alone. It was Isaac's hunger, cloaked in ritual, disguised as discipline, masked as fate. He had given his son to the water, and in his silence, in his cold composure, in the marks carved into William's skin, it was clear he believed he had done something righteous. The town buried its questions as surely as it buried William. The preacher told them it was God's will, the sheriff told them it was misfortune, and Isaac told them nothing at all. But the silence of one boy's grave became the shadow of the next, for William was only the beginning. The Brazos had taken its first air, and in the cold stillness of Isaac Dillon's eyes it was clear the river would not be asked to stop. 2 years passed before the river took again, though in truth it was not the river that chose, but the man who stood beside it. Thomas Dillon vanished in the same manner his brother had, swallowed by water during what should have been a routine crossing. The cattle drive that day had been small, the current mild, yet when the herd reached the far bank, Thomas was gone. Men who had ridden behind swore they had seen him flailing. Not as though surprised, but as though held under, his movements heavy and unnatural, as if the water itself had hands. They searched the bank until night, lanterns swinging in the dark. But nothing surfaced until days later, when a body drifted downstream, pale and bloated, marked by cuts too clean to be blamed on wood. The town said again that the river was cursed, but deep down they knew it was something else. What set this second death apart was not only its echo of the first, but the way Isaac carried himself afterward. He did not collapse into grief. did not shout at the heavens. The very next morning he appeared in church, seated in his pew as though nothing had broken inside his home. Men who stood near him whispered later that his clothes were still damp, that a faint smell of river water clung to him, yet his posture was calm, composed, untouched by the storm of sorrow that should have consumed a father who had now lost 2 sons. He bowed his head during prayer, but his eyes did not close. They stared forward, fixed, as though he was not listening to the preacher, but to something only he could hear. The whispers began to grow in town, carried behind closed doors and down hushed alleyways. 2 sons gone to the same river, both drowned under strange marks, both buried in closed coffins. Some said the Dillon family had been cursed, that the river would not release its grip until every son was gone. Others muttered of Isaac himself, of the cold way he spoke of fate, of the ledgers he kept as if life and death could be recorded like livestock tallies. Yet fear kept them quiet. Isaac was a man of stature, and the town had no taste for accusing one of their own without proof. Better to call it a curse, something supernatural, than to admit what their eyes suggested, that a father was offering his children like lambs to water. Inside the Dillon home, Mary shrank further into silence. Her movements grew hollow, her voice barely audible, as if the weight of grief had pinned her tongue. The younger boys watched with wide eyes as their father took Thomas's boots, cleaned them until they gleamed, and locked them away beside William's in the chest. The chest was kept at the foot of Isaac's bed, not as memorial but as possession. A collection of artifacts preserved spotless, untouched by dust or time. To him they were not reminders of loss but proof of ritual completed, a record of what had been given and sealed away. In the barns and fields, Isaac pressed his remaining sons harder. He demanded they carry heavier stones, stand longer in the current, endure silence without faltering. Each test was framed as preparation, as discipline, yet his eyes carried the same detached calm, whether they passed or failed. To Isaac, each act of endurance was not survival but judgment, a weighing of their worth against the standard he alone measured. If they broke, the river would cleanse. If they endured, the river would wait. Either outcome satisfied the twisted arithmetic that guided him. The town's silence deepened into complicity. Neighbors recalled seeing Isaac lead Thomas down to the banks in the evenings, remembered the boy's thin frame trembling under the weight of river stones, but no one spoke. To accuse a man so respected would mean tearing open the fragile order of their lives, and so they chose superstition instead. They told their children to avoid the river. They prayed for protection. But they did not confront the man whose calm presence in church felt more damning than any confession. By the time Thomas's grave was filled, the pattern had hardened into something undeniable. This was not chance, not misfortune repeated. This was rhythm, method, a design written in water and silence. Isaac Dillon's family was being consumed one son at a time, and the town, though it saw the truth in fragments, chose to look away. And in Isaac's locked chest, 2 pairs of spotless boots now lay side by side, silent trophies of a father who believed himself in service not to God or to family, but to a darker law written in the flow of the Brazos River. Henry Dillon was different from his brothers in ways that unsettled Isaac. Where William had carried his father's strength and Thomas his sharpness, Henry had a softness that resisted shaping. He lingered by the animals, stroking their hides, whispering calm when storms frightened them. He lingered by the fields, watching the movement of wind through grass as if it carried meaning. Isaac saw this not as kindness but as weakness, a weakness that threatened the purity of the bloodline he recorded in his ledgers. And so the father turned his full weight upon him, pressing harder than he ever had with the others. Determined to drive gentleness from Henry's body as if it were sickness. The rituals began at night, when the house was dark and neighbors could not see. Isaac would wake Henry and march him to the river, placing cold stones into his hands, forcing him to carry them until his arms trembled. He would push him into the water and hold him beneath, not long enough to kill, but long enough to leave Henry coughing and gasping on the bank. Isaac called these cleansings. He whispered prayers that spoke of sacrifice and purity, prayers not heard in church but invented in the silence of his own mind. They were not words of faith but words of control, muttered as he pressed his son's head below the current. Henry's resistance grew not from defiance but from fear. He began to fight against the water, his small hands clawing against his father's grip. His cries muffled by the river that swallowed his voice. Isaac saw this struggle as proof of impurity, proof that more was needed. The boy grew pale, his body worn by nights that left him shivering. He began to move slower during the day, his once gentle hands now trembling even when touching a calf or carrying a tool. Mary saw the change but said nothing. Her silence had already hardened into something unbreakable, her voice stripped by grief and fear. Samuel, the youngest, watched in terror, knowing that the same darkness would one day fall on him. The house had become not a place of shelter but a place of preparation, each room echoing with unspoken dread. The night of Henry's drowning came when the river was calm, its surface black and glass-like under a thin moon. Isaac led him there with no words, only the heavy presence of command. He stripped the boy of his shirt and forced him into the water, demanding he stand still against the current. Henry tried, his body shaking, his breath short, but Isaac's voice pressed on him like the weight of the stones themselves. He dunked the boy under again and again, muttering prayers, forcing him to recite lines about obedience and purity. When Henry's voice broke into sobs, Isaac pushed him harder, holding him down longer until his body thrashed in panic. The drowning did not come as accident but as completion. Isaac forced silt into the boy's mouth, grinding it between his teeth, filling his lungs not only with water but with the earth of the riverbed. To Isaac, this was purification, binding flesh to soil, water to blood. To Henry, it was suffocation beyond struggle, his body collapsing in silence as his father whispered the final prayer. When the boy went limp, Isaac pulled him out and laid him on the bank, staring at him as though inspecting work finished. There was no cry, no attempt at revival, only the calm of a man who believed he had done what was required. When Henry's body was found, the town told itself the same story it had told before. Another son lost to the river, another coffin lowered into the ground. But those who examined him saw more than drowning. His lungs were filled with thick silt, packed inside as though forced. His lips were torn where mud had been pressed into him. His chest carried marks not of wood but of hands, deliberate and strong. Yet once again the sheriff wrote the word accident. Once again the preacher spoke of God's mysterious will. And once again the town looked away. Isaac placed Henry's boots in the chest beside the others, polished, spotless, preserved. 3 pairs now rested there, silent trophies of sacrifice, each one gleaming as if untouched by earth. He wrote Henry's death in his ledger, marking the river's depth and the time of night, noting the words cleansing complete. The chest closed with a heavy lock, and the sound of it echoed through the house like a seal. For Isaac, the ritual was not tragedy but duty, carried out with the calm cruelty of belief. For Mary and Samuel, it was the confirmation of what they had always feared, that there would be no end until the last son was taken. The river flowed on, its surface smooth, carrying away the last cries of the gentle boy who had tried to resist. And in Isaac's silence, in his steady walk back from the bank, it was clear that the water would be asked to take again. Mary Dillon's silence had always been the quiet hum beneath the violence of her husband's will, but after Henry's death it deepened into something raw, a silence that scraped against the edges of madness. Neighbors who came by with food or prayers found her thinner each week, her hair pulled harshly back, her hands trembling as though they had forgotten what rest was. Some noticed the strange state of her nails, split and broken as if she had clawed at wood or stone in desperation. They whispered of grief consuming her, but in truth it was not grief that drove her body to ruin. It was the horror of knowing what Isaac was and being powerless to stop it. She had tried once to scratch her way into the locked chest at the foot of their bed and to reach the boots that had become grim relics of her sons. When Isaac caught her, his silence was worse than any words. After that night, her nails were always jagged, and she carried herself with the posture of someone who knew she had no more choices left. She began to speak in fragments, whispered sentences that escaped her lips like the slipping of breath in sleep. A neighbor claimed to have heard her mutter that Isaac marked the boys before the river took them, carving signs no one else could see. Another swore, she whispered, that the river did not choose at all, that it was Isaac who decided when and how, that the water was only the tool. But she never spoke these words loudly, never said them in a room where her husband stood. In his presence she lowered her head, moving through the house like a shadow waiting for evening. The weight of her silence became its own kind of confession, a truth too dangerous to put fully into the world. Her body weakened quickly, faster than neighbors believed grief alone could explain. She coughed at night, her voice thin and rattling. Isaac told the town it was an illness of the lungs, that the damp air of the river had poisoned her chest. The doctor who came could do little, claiming it was likely pneumonia, nothing unusual in a woman worn by work and sorrow. Yet those who saw her after she passed away could not shake what they noticed. There were marks along her neck and collarbone, faint but deliberate, the kind that could not be explained by coughing or illness. They looked like the shadow of rope or cloth pulled tight, a strangling grip hidden under the folds of her dress. But the town accepted the story, as they had with the sons, and the cause of death was recorded simply as sickness. Mary's burial was quiet, without the mournful cries one would expect from a family torn apart by loss. Isaac stood at the grave with the same calm he had carried through each funeral, his face unreadable, his lips pressed thin. He did not pray, did not bow his head, only watched the soil cover her coffin, as though he were closing another ledger entry, another piece of a pattern now complete. Samuel stood beside him, the last remaining son, his small frame stiff with fear. He had no words for what he had seen, no way to resist what he knew was coming. The widow's silence had become his inheritance, a silence that pressed down upon him with the weight of inevitability. In the days after her burial, the neighbors noticed Isaac more often at the river, standing at its edge in the fading light. He no longer had a wife to mask his devotion, no partner to absorb suspicion. His house became stripped of any trace of warmth, a place now filled only with the order of his rituals and the echo of his cold arithmetic. The chest at the foot of his bed held not just the spotless boots of his sons, but now, in the quiet of the house, the memory of his wife's final breaths. The river flowed, carrying on as though nothing had changed, but within its current lay the unspoken truth. Mary Dillon had seen too much, had spoken enough to be silenced, and her death was not sickness but the final proof that no voice could challenge Isaac's design. The discovery came not from suspicion but from chance, the way a loose board or an unlocked door sometimes allows the truth to slip into daylight. After Mary's death, a neighbor woman entered the Dillon home under the pretense of bringing food for Samuel, the last surviving boy. She wandered further than she should have, drawn by the silence that clung to the rooms like dust. In Isaac's bedroom she found the chest, a heavy oak box set at the foot of the bed, its surface rubbed smooth by years of polishing. The lock hung open, as if Isaac had grown so certain of the town's blindness that he no longer cared to hide what was inside. When the lid was lifted, the air in the room seemed to turn heavy, carrying the smell of oil, leather, and something older, something that should have remained buried. Inside lay the relics of a family not remembered with love but catalogued like offerings. Each son had left behind a pair of boots, cleaned until the leather shone. Not a speck of dirt clinging to their soles. Bundles of hair were tied with string, strands clipped close to the scalp and preserved as though they were proof of possession. Among the hair and boots were small bones carved with deliberate marks, faint grooves that traced patterns no one could name. The most chilling objects were the stones, river stones, each etched with the initials of a son. The letters cut deep as though the stone itself had been conscripted into Isaac's ledger. These were not mementos but trophies, evidence of ritual, proof that each life had been not lost but surrendered. The chest's contents spread through the town like sickness, each detail carried in hushed tones from neighbor to neighbor. Fear swelled, but fear does not always lead to justice. The sheriff was called and the objects laid out before him. He studied the boots, the hair, the bones, the stones, and his face hardened not with outrage but with weariness. He told the town it was the work of a grieving father, a man who could not let go of what he had lost. He closed the chest and declared it strange but not criminal, grief but not evidence. The law, bound by its narrow view, chose to call the relics mourning rather than confession. The town swallowed the decision, though their eyes betrayed the terror they could not put into words. Isaac himself showed no shame when word reached him. He did not deny the chest, did not hide the relics. He explained them with calm certainty, saying, "A father has a right to remember his sons, to preserve the pieces that proved they once lived." His voice was even, his hands steady, his eyes unblinking. He looked not like a man accused, but like a man vindicated, as though the sheriff's dismissal had confirmed what he already believed, that no one would dare condemn him. He returned the chest to his room, locked it once more, and slept above it each night as though resting over the sealed graves of his own creation. The townsfolk carried the unease like a second skin. They avoided the Dillon ranch, crossing the street when Isaac walked into town, lowering their voices when his name was spoken. Yet none acted against him. Their fear of the man and the river he worshipped was greater than their desire for justice. They told themselves it was not their place, that the sheriff had spoken, that grief makes men strange. But deep inside they knew the truth. The chest was not a shrine of remembrance but an altar of ritual. And by dismissing it they had allowed Isaac to continue. Samuel, the youngest, lived under the weight of that chest. He saw his brothers reduced to objects, their lives preserved as fragments sealed away in the dark. He knew his own boots, his own hair, his own stone would one day be added. Each night he lay awake, hearing the creak of the lock, the closing of the lid, the sound of his father recording another entry in the ledger. The chest was no longer hidden. It was accepted, tolerated, allowed to exist in the open. And in that acceptance, the town itself became complicit, each silence another nail driven into the boy's inevitable coffin. The chest remained in the Dillon house, a silent presence more powerful than any sermon or law. Its weight grew not only from the objects inside, but from the fear it represented. Proof that Isaac's rituals could be seen and still excused. And as long as it remained unopened by true justice, it promised only one thing, that the river would be asked to take again, and the last son's fate was already sealed. Samuel Dillon had lived his short years under the shadow of absence, his every step watched by the empty places where his brothers should have been. The ranch was quieter now, stripped of voices, stripped of laughter, stripped of any noise but the steady commands of Isaac and the sound of cattle moving across the land. Samuel knew he was the last, not because anyone told him, but because the house itself whispered it. He saw his brother's boots sealed in the chest, their stones carved with initials, their memory preserved like artifacts in a shrine. He moved through his days with the weight of inevitability. Each chore, each meal, each night walk to the river teaching him that he was not living, but waiting. The spring flood came with sudden violence, rains pounding the plains until the Brazos swelled beyond its banks, swallowing fence posts and dragging away livestock. The river was no longer calm, no longer a tool of discipline. It was wild, swollen, dangerous. Yet Isaac chose this moment to bring Samuel to the water, claiming the boy must be tested against the river at its strongest. Neighbors saw them leave in the storm, the father's hand on the boy's shoulder, the boy's face pale beneath the flickering light of the lantern. No one followed. No one interfered. Fear long cultivated kept them behind their doors. When Samuel's body was found days later, it bore marks that no accident could explain. The boy had not only drowned. His chest was bound with river reeds woven and knotted in deliberate patterns that crossed over his ribs like binding straps. The reeds had cut into his skin, leaving grooves that told of restraint, not rescue. His lungs, when opened by the coroner, were filled not just with water but with thick debris, branches, and mud forced deep until his body had no room left for air. It was as if the river had been stuffed into him, sealing him from within. To those who saw him, the death carried the weight of ritual, a final offering crafted with precision. When Isaac spoke, his words turned the horror into something colder. He stood before the sheriff and the townsmen without trembling, his voice steady, his eyes clear. He said the river had called for Samuel, that God demanded his lineage be given back to water, that his sons had been chosen to cleanse what was impure. He did not cry or beg for mercy. He testified as though explaining a simple truth, one written into the fabric of the land itself. Hardened men, men who had buried wives and children of their own, felt their stomachs turn as they listened. His calmness was not human grief, but something else, the composure of a man who believed his cruelty was righteousness. The sheriff, faced with this testimony, wrote once again the word accident, though his hand shook as he did. To charge Isaac would mean admitting what they had ignored for years, would mean confessing their own silence as complicity. Easier to call it God's will, easier to let the river carry blame. The town swallowed the story the way it had before, burying Samuel in a coffin no larger than a feed trough, lowering him into the ground beside his brothers as if the earth itself had grown weary of receiving them. Isaac returned home after the burial and placed Samuel's boots in the chest, polished until they gleamed. 4 pairs now lay inside, each spotless, each preserved, each representing a son erased and transformed into artifact. He locked the chest and returned to his ledgers, marking the date of the flood, the depth of the water, and the words offering complete. He carried himself as though nothing had ended, as though the ritual had only reached its natural conclusion. The river receded in the weeks that followed, leaving behind wreckage of driftwood and broken fences. But in the minds of those who lived near it, the Brazos no longer looked like water. It looked like a grave, endless and patient. And in the silence of Isaac Dillon's calm explanation, the town understood a truth they would never speak aloud. Samuel's death was not the river's work, not the will of God, but the final act of a man who had given every piece of his family to the current with deliberate hands. The final offering was complete, and in its completion, Isaac stood not as a grieving father, but as a figure who had remade murder into ritual and silence into law. The death of Samuel Dillon should have broken the town into outrage, but instead it moved them into uneasy hesitation. The sheriff, weary and shaken, brought the matter before the courthouse, if only because whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Men gathered in the square, women pressed close to door frames, all speaking of reeds tied across a child's chest and lungs filled with mud. For once, The people wanted answers. Yet in that dim courthouse, with its cracked windows and dusty benches, justice bent beneath the weight of Isaac's presence. He did not enter as a broken man, but as a figure of calm authority, the same way he carried himself in church or market. His reputation as a hard-working rancher, his silence mistaken for dignity, worked as a shield that no testimony could pierce. The jurors were men who had eaten at his table, traded cattle with him, prayed beside him. They looked at Isaac and saw not a murderer but a patriarch, a man who had endured the loss of every son without complaint. To accuse him would mean accusing themselves, for they had watched the drownings unfold in sequence, had seen the marks, had heard Mary's whispers, and yet had done nothing. To find him guilty was to expose their own silence as complicity, and so the testimonies twisted into confusion. The coroner, who spoke of reeds knotted around Samuel's chest, faltered under questioning. His words softened until they resembled mistake. The neighbors who had seen Isaac leave for the river on storm nights told their stories, but ended with shrugs, unwilling to say aloud what they feared. Each account dissolved into suggestion rather than accusation. And Isaac, sitting straight-backed and stone-faced, never spoke except to say he had given his children over to God's will. When the time came for indictment, the jury refused. They declared there was no evidence of crime, only tragedy, only misfortune compounded by the dangerous river that claimed many lives. The records, thin as they were, vanished into courthouse drawers, never to be brought forward again. Officially, Isaac Dillon's name remained clean, untarnished, the deaths of his wife and sons reduced to accidents, the whispers erased by signatures and seals. The town returned to their homes with relief that justice had not asked them to confront what they had long avoided. It was easier to believe in curses and accidents than in the reality of a man who sacrificed his family under their very eyes. Isaac returned to his ranch without punishment, his land still in his name, his cattle still grazing, his chest still locked at the foot of his bed. He lived quietly, a solitary figure walking the fence lines, tending to chores as though nothing had been lost. With no heirs left, his home grew emptier, but he moved through it with the composure of a man who had completed what he set out to do. The townsfolk avoided his gaze when he came to market, yet none challenged him. Their silence became the final seal on his ritual, the last act of complicity that allowed him to stand untouched by law or shame. The horror of the trial was not in its verdict, but in its refusal to exist at all. It was a trial that never truly happened, a performance staged only to maintain appearances, a proceeding built not to reveal truth but to bury it. The silence of the court became another layer of Isaac's design, a silence that echoed the silence of his home, the silence of his punishments, the silence of his wife's bruised throat. Justice, like the townspeople, had chosen to look away. And in that silence, Isaac Dillon was left free, a man who had given every piece of his bloodline to the river and walked away unpunished, his name unbroken, his rituals unseen, his ledger closed without stain. After the trial faded into nothing, the Dillon ranch began to wither. The fences leaned, the fields grew patchy, and the barns sagged against the weight of time. Without heirs to work the land, Isaac managed alone, but neighbors noticed that he no longer cared for prosperity. His movements became more ritual than labor, tending cattle and mending fences only as if to pass the hours, not to build a future. The ranch itself grew hollow, a shell that mirrored the silence of the man who walked it. When Isaac finally passed, whether by age, illness, or the quiet hand of the river itself, the house stood empty, its windows black, its doors unlatched, yet the land did not lose its power. What lingered there was not memory of wealth or cattle, but the unspoken weight of what had been offered to the Brazos. Children who lived in the area grew up with the story of the Dillon boys. They were told not to swim in the river, not because of currents or snakes, but because whispers said the boys still breathed beneath the water. Some swore that on quiet nights, if you stood by the bank, you could hear voices just under the surface, voices that gasped and choked as though lungs were still full of silt. Parents repeated these warnings not as legend but as caution. Convinced that the river had grown hungry from what Isaac had fed it and would not hesitate to take others if disrespected. The Dillon name was spoken less and less, fading into fragments of warning until the story became less about a man and more about the river itself, a river that claimed what was not pure, yet traces of Isaac's mind survived. Decades later, a preacher restoring hymnals in the old church found scraps of paper tucked between the pages. The ink was faded, but the words clear. They were not prayers in the language of Scripture, but twisted reflections that blended faith with obsession. Isaac had written about cleansing bloodlines, about the mixing of soil and water to erase weakness, about sons as vessels meant to be tested until they either stood unbroken or were given back to the current. He spoke of himself as chosen, a steward of purity, tasked with returning flesh to the river as payment for the corruption of the land. These writings, preserved by chance, carried his voice into a future he could not control. A voice that revealed not grief but design. The preacher who found them copied the words into his own notes, disturbed by the clarity of Isaac's logic. These were not ramblings but structured belief. The cold arithmetic of a man who convinced himself that murder was duty. He wrote of boots polished because dirt was a symbol of imperfection, of hair clipped to prevent weakness from spreading, of stones marked with initials so the river could recognize its offerings. The details matched the whispers of the chest, the ledgers, the rituals at the riverbank. It was not madness in the sense of chaos, but madness bound to method, a worldview that stripped humanity away from family and replaced it with the mechanics of sacrifice. Generations passed, and the ranch fell fully into ruin. Weeds choked the fields, boards collapsed, and wind tore shingles from the roof. Yet people avoided clearing it. No one wanted to build there, no one wanted to claim it. The land was left to rot, as if the soil itself was poisoned by what it had witnessed. Travelers passing through remarked on the stillness around the ranch, the way birds avoided the trees near the house, the way the river seemed darker at that bend. For locals, it was not just superstition but survival. They believed the land remembered, and to disturb it was to risk waking what had never truly slept. The legacy of Isaac Dillon was not written in stone or court records, but in silence and fear. His name eroded, but his actions etched themselves into the warnings told to children, the sermons whispered by uneasy preachers, the documents hidden away and only rarely spoken of. The horror was not only that a father had given his sons to water, but that the community, the church, and the law had allowed him. The river carried his ritual forward, its surface calm, its depths heavy with memory. And every time a child was told not to swim there, every time the wind rattled through the ruins of the ranch, Isaac's design lived on, not as history but as a haunting that shaped how generations understood the silence of evil. A century after Isaac Dillon's quiet death, the land he once ruled was nothing more than brittle earth and rotting beams. The ranch had collapsed into itself, the chest long vanished, the house torn apart by storms and scavengers. Yet beneath the weeds and stones, the ground still carried secrets. When researchers arrived, drawn by old county maps and fragments of rumor, they unearthed what the town had tried to bury in silence. Shallow pits lined with rough wood gave way to bones scattered and incomplete, yet arranged in ways that betrayed intent. The skeletons bore signs not of age alone, but of deliberate cruelty. Rib cages were warped, sternums broken inward, and soil still clung to jaws as if packed there at the time of death. These were not burials of respect, but of ritual, bodies offered to earth after water had already claimed them. Evil does not always announce itself with violence in the open. Sometimes it wears the face of respectability, the steady hands of a provider, the bowed head of a churchgoer. Isaac Dillon had been such a figure, cloaked in discipline, admired for endurance, spoken of as fair. The town, the law, and even the church chose to see only what confirmed their comfort. Behind closed doors, he built rituals of control, drowning his sons in silence. Yet in public, he was received as a man of order. His evil thrived not because it was invisible, but because it was tolerated, wrapped in the protection of institutions that looked away rather than confront what lived among them. The family, broken and bound by fear, became the first shield. Mary's voice was crushed until her whispers turned into sickness, her resistance erased beneath bruises hidden by clothing. The sons carried stones, bore punishments, endured silence, and in their obedience they became complicit victims of a system designed to strip them of choice. The church, meant to speak for mercy, instead bowed to Isaac's presence in the pews, mistaking his composure for faith. And the law, faced with evidence carved into bodies and etched into bones, closed its ledgers with the word accident, preferring ignorance to confrontation. Together they formed a wall of silence around him, allowing each ritual to continue until there were no sons left to give. The most chilling truth was not that Isaac believed he was chosen, but that others allowed him to act on that belief. His ledger became scripture, his chest became altar, his river became judge, and no voice strong enough rose to name it for what it was. The silence of the community was not neutral, it was participation. Their refusal to accuse became another knot in the reeds that bound the boys' chests, another handful of silt pressed into their lungs. Even now, more than a century later, the questions remain heavy. How many men like Isaac hide behind the mask of respectability protected by the same silence? How many evils walk unchallenged in ordinary homes, disguised as discipline, shielded by institutions that choose reputation over truth? The Brazos River carried away the Dillon sons, but it also carried a lesson too dark for many to face. Evil often waits in plain sight, patient and methodical, feeding on silence until it is complete. And the greater horror is not the man who commits it, but the world that lets him.